President Heather.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We are so lucky to have all of you here with us today. And most of you know I'm Heather Baker, your 2020 president, and we are so honored to have South Carolina Senator Tom Davis with us today. Senator Davis, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you guys again.
Thank you. I just want to go over a couple of event procedures for today. There's not going to be a PowerPoint presentation. We're going to do exclusively a discussion with Senator Davis. We are going to have this recorded, so if you guys want to come back and reflect back or share it with others within your brokerage, you're more than happy to. And all attendees are going to be muted. If you would like to ask a question, you can go to the chat box. You may have to move your cursor around a little bit down at the bottom, and Ms. Jean's going to be monitoring that. Senator Davis, how are you doing?
Doing pretty well, thanks. Exciting times where we're opening back up.
Yes, we're excited about that. Thank you so much. We're just going to start, we're going to get to it today, and we were very pleased to hear that you were selected by the governor to participate in the Accelerate SC program. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about that and what's to be expected from the task force, please?
Right. Well, thank you very much for asking me that question, because I think it is the most important thing I can talk about this morning. As you know, Governor McMaster formed a committee, a 39 or 29 member committee to address certain practical aspects that would be associated with his lifting of executive orders and restrictions on individual actions and what were the challenges that were posed as a response to that. And so there's basically 5 areas, and I'm just going to summarize each of the 5 areas that we've discussed. And each of these 5 areas has a subgroup. I've attended each of the 5 subgroup meetings last week. There were 5 meetings. Also attended the week prior to that, the organizational meeting. And then tomorrow we have another meeting of all the groups. But the 5 subgroups are, first one's response, which is to identify the challenges related to workforce capacity, workforce reentry, critical industries, capital requirements, regulatory issues, and supply chain logistics. And what our discussion in that subgroup centered around primarily was safety protocols. I mean, if you're a certain industry or a certain business, what are the best practices? What are the operating safety protocols you have to undertake in order to make sure that your employees are safe? And then equally important, to reassure the public that it is safe for them to patronize these businesses. So if you simply lift the executive orders and authorize businesses to go back, to open back up, that doesn't really solve your problem. First of all, you have to have employers that are willing to open back up. And second of all, you have to have individuals willing to patronize those establishments. And there's a host of legal issues surrounding all those things. And one of them is this notion of worries about civil liability. Businesses have worries about civil liability. If somebody comes to their establishment and contracts the virus, are they going to be open to civil lawsuit by virtue of that? And that's a very real concern. I mean, you have law firms all over the country gearing up for this particular opportunity, for lack of a better word. And what we're talking about at the state level, at least in this limited respect, is providing like a 6-month safe harbor, so that if you're a business or an establishment, if you follow best practices as promulgated by either your trade association or by the LLR, and if you follow basic safety protocols and you can demonstrate that you've done so, that for a period of 6 months, you're not going to be subject to civil liability for somebody coming in and saying, hey, your environment or your workforce regulations led to me contracting the virus. I think that's critically important. You don't want to remove liability completely forever, but as we're restarting and as businesses are starting to learn the rules of the game and what best practices are, if we want to get things up and going, you've got to provide that particular assurance, I believe, because you can't insure against it. Businesses can't get liability insurance to cover that. So there's a lot of discussion about that. And we can talk about that more later. Second is protection, identifying protective protocols for practical implementation in the workplace, public testing, and contract tracing, supply of PPE, and long-term mitigation efforts. I mean, this, in a nutshell, talks about continuing our best practices, continue to wash our hands, to continue to respect people's personal space. If you can avoid large crowds, avoid large crowds. I mean, just because Governor McMaster has lifted and is starting to lift these orders, it doesn't mean that we can abandon these behaviors that we've learned over the last couple of months, because all indications are across the ideological spectrum is that there's likely to be a second wave of this virus in the fall. And so the lessons that we've learned over the last couple of months and the best practices that we've learned as a society, if we continue those, then we can mitigate what the impact is going to be in the fall. We're not going to worry about, overtaxing our hospital resources. We're not going to worry about overtaxing the supply of PPE and other things that the medical community needs to keep us well. So focusing on maintaining those best practices, and then also ramping up testing as much as possible, both the PCR testing, the antibody testing, the use of contact tracers. I mean, trying to get a very good map of where the virus is, where outbreaks occur, so that we can concentrate our resources in a rapid way to quell that. So, we should be excited and be optimistic about reopening things. Everybody's ready to get back to work. But there are things that we have to continue to do from a public health perspective, in recognition of the fact that this virus is not done and that we're going to probably see another outbreak in the fall. And if we take precautions now, do the testing, keep up our best practices, we might not have to have the same sort of draconian response that we've seen the last couple of months. So that's that subgroup, is protection. Governance. There's a whole lot of governance issues that the 2-month pandemic imposed on us. When the legislature appropriates money to state agencies, it usually does so saying you will spend money for a particular purpose. You go ahead and designate what the money is to be spent on. What you hear state agencies saying is that we have had to shift our resources from what you've originally intended, and we've had to shift them toward addressing the COVID pandemic. And so what they want is flexibility. Again, not long-term, but in the short term, they want flexibility in regard to their ability to take the appropriated funds and then to marshal those funds and spend them in those areas that are necessitated by responding to the virus. And that's something that we as a legislature have to do. At the local level, with counties and with municipalities, they're also asking for flexibility in regard to spending. For instance, there are existing parameters on what money can be spent for accommodation and hospitality taxes. Local governments want the ability, more flexibility in regard to how to spend those monies because of having to respond to the COVID pandemic. There's also some procedural questions that localities have about the legal legitimacy of virtual meetings, the legal legitimacy of discussing via Skype or Zoom or Google Hangout or whatever it is. Does that discharge the statutory requirement for public meetings? They want clarity in that regard. And I think it's important that we as a legislature provide that. They're also wanting various flexibilities. For instance, local government fund revenues that the General Assembly appropriates each year for local governments that are usually accessed by local governments on a quarterly basis. They want to front end some of that money because they have needs now. They want to have those restrictions taken off. Various local governments have obligations to the state to pay back on the state revolving fund for certain projects they have. They want a suspension of those payments. So there's a whole host of things that our local governments are requesting in terms of flexibility to accommodate their need to shift resources around. The Resources Committee, and this may be one of the most important committees. And this is one of the ones that I sit on as well as a member of the subgroup. It's deciding how South Carolina is going to spend the $2 billion that the CARES Act provided to the governor's office to respond to the COVID pandemic. I mean, if you'll recall, the CARES Act had various tranches. You had the immediate direct payment of $1,200, $5,000 or less. You had the supplement by the federal government to regular state unemployment insurance benefits. They were supplemented by $600 a week. You had payments being made to hospitals and other healthcare establishments. You had the establishment of the Small Business Administration's programs to help small businesses, the Payroll Protection Program, the EIDL. But one aspect of that bill that hasn't been talked about a lot, and it's going to be talked about a lot now, is direct appropriations by the federal government to the governor's office, largely based on a per capita allocation, with the stipulation that no state could get less than $1.25 billion. Our share of that is $2 billion. So Governor McMaster has to spend between March 1, which is when the funds became authorized and were distributed out of the states, and by the end of this calendar year, December 31, has to spend that $2 billion on COVID-related items. And so we're having an intense debate about what that money should be spent on. And there hasn't been a final recommendation made yet, but I can tell you some of the things that we have been talking about. First of all, reimbursements to state agencies. I think that's a logical thing. To the extent that state agencies had to start appropriating or spending their money that we had given to them, to the extent that they spent that on COVID-related things, I think you replenish their coffers so that they can then spend the money on the various programs that the money was initially appropriated for. So I think that's going to take a big chunk of that $2 billion, is making state agencies whole as a result of them allocating more of their resources toward COVID as opposed to what was initially intended. Second of all, there is a need to expand our testing capacity. You know, both the PCR tests, the antibody tests, and also we need to expand the number of contact tracers in South Carolina. We've already ramped up. We had 20 before this pandemic began. It's been ramped up now by DHEC to 220. And some estimates are that we may need as many as 1,000 contact tracers. And what they do, as you all probably know, is that if there is a confirmed case, then these contact tracers interview that person, try to identify individuals with whom that person who has the virus has been in contact with, and then have those individuals quarantined. That contact tracing has been found to be an extremely effective way of flattening out that demand curve and making sure that our hospital resources aren't overtaxed. So I think a good portion of that money, of the $2 billion, needs to go toward giving DHEC what DHEC says it needs in order to be vigilant during this period between the first wave, and we're going back out there and resuming economic activities, and that's great, but we can't let our guard down over the summer and the fall, because everything we do now in terms of prevention, preparation, best practices is going to make sure that what happens in the fall doesn't disrupt our economy in the same way this first wave did. And then finally, you know, one of the things that's been talked about is using some of that $2 billion to expand broadband access across South Carolina, because one of the things that this pandemic has taught us is that a lot of educational instruction materials and a lot of healthcare advice is consumed online or virtually or through telemedicine or online courses. And you can do a map of South Carolina and you can see pockets of South Carolina that simply don't have broadband access. And so what you're essentially saying is these educational resources and healthcare resources aren't equally available to all South Carolinians. And that clearly is unfair on its face. And so I think that's another expenditure we're looking at in regard to that $2 billion. So in order of priority, I would say replenishing the resources of state agencies that have expended money, providing DHEC what it says it needs in order to do the appropriate amount of testing and to prepare for a potential second wave. And then lastly, to address this broadband capacity issue. And then finally, information. And this relates to making sure that DHEC, the governor's office, the executive branch, provides relevant information in real time to individuals and businesses so they can make informed choices as to what's in their best interest. I mean, it's critically important, and it's also important in this respect. if you're going to have respect for what the government does in terms of putting on restrictions or in terms of making decisions on reopenings, people need to see the information upon which those decisions are being made. I mean, nothing sows distrust more than withholding information or simply announcing a decision and people throwing up their hands trying to figure out what the rationale is. It is extraordinarily important that we get good information out there in an easily accessible way. And so those are those are the 5 broad categories in which we've just week's worth of meetings. I mean, this is literally for the last 9 days been all I've done for about 15, 16 hours a day, because it's extraordinarily important that we get all of these things right, not only to make sure that this reopening that's ongoing now is successful, but to make sure that we're prepared for the second wave, and so that the second wave does not cause the kind of disruption that the first one did.
Thank you.
Pause there and respond to questions, or just talk about something else if you'd like.
No, that's okay. You went straight down the list that I had printed out too, so great job. Ms. Jean, do we have any questions in the chat
I
on
do
this
have
topic?
a couple of them, please. Is South Carolina planning to do marketing during the RBC Heritage Tournament to let the world know we're open? Know that one, Senator?
Yeah, I think Dwayne Parrish talked a little bit about that, the director of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. He, as an aside, mentioned that that's an extraordinarily good opportunity for us to speak directly to the people of the United States and to, go ahead and talk about what South Carolina has done to address this pandemic, to talk about what's been done to ensure that people who visit South Carolina can do so safely. So I guess the short answer to that, though I'm a politician, I can't give a short answer to that is yes. I think it's an excellent opportunity for us to get that message out to people.
Right. Okay. That's great. I agree. And I think it's going to be loud and clear, which is great. I did have another question here. Someone else was asking about, should it be deemed mandatory to all businesses with people interacting with clients, customers, or contractors to wear masks till the virus has subsided?
Yeah, I think that's going to fall under the category of what does DHEC consider to be best practices and proper safety protocols in regard to businesses that reopen. And I think, I think the answer to that question is going to be, it depends. If you've got a business that by its nature will involve a larger concentration of people or more immediacy between the person, the employer, and the employee or the customers, for instance, nail salons and hairdressers, if there is by definition a more immediate proximity between individuals, I think the answer to that question is probably yes. In other instances, it may not be necessary given the nature of the business. So, and I think that's the way that Governor McMaster and also Dr. Bell at DHEC have been approaching this, is to what sort of protocols and what sort of best practices are appropriate for a given particular business situation. So in some instances, in some cases, I can see the answer to that question being yes, and others it might be no. But the important thing here is, and this goes back to a point I made earlier, Gene, is that for these businesses, whether it's restaurants or nail salons or whatever it is, that there be a very clear articulation of what best practices and safety protocols are, and to make sure that that's made public and to make sure that they abide by them. And that goes back to the question of a qualified immunity from civil liability. If they follow these best practices and if they demonstrate that they've done so, that then lays the predicate for saying, okay, for a 6-month period, we're not going to subject you to civil liability, provided you had provided these upfront protocols and best practices.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting too, you say that. So I would say that probably falls under our realtor members here as well, as when they're going out with clients and customers and protecting themselves and their clients and customers. Probably a good idea to keep a list and practices of what you're doing, so you have a documentation of what you've been.
Yeah, and I think too, you're right, Gene. But I think too, what we ought to be in terms of government and government agencies, we ought to be mindful of the fact that a lot of these associations, whether it's the Restaurant and Lodging Association, the realtors, the home builders, it's in their best interest to develop best practices for their members. And I think we need to stay away from the temptation to have government come in and dictate standards we at the very least have to engage these professional associations, listen to what they believe, will protect their members and allow their members to safely interact with the public. And we need to be respectful of that and quite frankly, incorporate them into the best practices, because you guys are in a position to know best what is it going to take in order to keep your employees safe or your agents or members safe, and what are the ways in which they can safely engage with the public.
Okay, good points. I got a few more questions here, Ms. Heather, so I'm going to just keep going because they've got Andy Twisdale is asking, how do you feel about the 1.1 billion from 2019 surplus? Will that be used?
Yeah, I think that money, well, two things, Andy. This current fiscal year before the pandemic hit, it was projected that we had $2 billion in extra money to spend. About $1 billion of that was one-time money. Another $1 billion of that was based on a projected increase in recurring revenues. That latter $1 billion is gone. There is no projected increase in recurring revenues anymore. In fact, we're quite likely operating probably, if we're lucky, at last year's budgetary levels, if not something less, which is one of the reasons why the General Assembly is going to pass a continuing resolution May 12 when we go back into session, which essentially keeps government open and operating based on last year's budget. And then we're going to delay our formal budget deliberations till September. The second week of September, we're going to go back in and we're going to pass an Appropriations Act then that is then retroactive to July 1, which is the beginning of the fiscal year. And the reason we're having to wait until September in order to have those budget discussions is we don't know, we don't have reliable estimates of what the available revenues are going to be until that time, until we see it the last couple of quarters, and then we can make safe projections. Andy, your question, I think, does have relevance in regard to the $1 billion of one-time money that was projected. Much of that money had already been collected prior to the pandemic. It wasn't dependent upon continuing economic activities. And so to your point, Andy, I think, that $1 billion, whereas in the past it might have been spent on a wish list, I think you're going to see when we finally get around to appropriating that $1 billion of one-time money in September, you're going to see a strong bias towards doing things that are COVID related or virus related, or perhaps in regard to improving the overall public health of South Carolinians. So yes, I mean, there may have been, heck, I had a wish list of what I wanted to have funding out of that $1 billion, ranging from the Jasper Port to the Hilton Head Island Airport to the Cross Parkway to Mitchellville to, I mean, look, I'm like anybody else. I mean, if the money's going to get spent, I'm going to go in there and fight for my district. But I think all of us are going to have to step back and realize that there's probably going to be a more important priority come this fall.
I think you might be right. Just a couple of more questions here, and then we'll move on to the next thing. With the allocation of funds, will they assist in funding grants such as Palmetto Heroes to assist keeping the home building industry moving forward?
Yeah, I think there's the governor's office is going to set up an apparatus at the Department of Administration, because this $2 billion doesn't go through the legislative process. Okay, this $2 billion was given by Congress or the U.S. Treasury directly to governors. And so my understanding is the governor is going to set up an apparatus or a procedure at the Department of Administration so that individuals or entities or people can suggest expenditures. And I guess the short answer to that is you can make an application, you can make the case for why it's important. And then ultimately it comes right out of the governor, because the governor is the one with the responsibility under the CARES Act and the obligation to spend that money. So you can make the case, but whether or not that case survives other cases that are being made, I couldn't speculate.
Mm-hmm. And then one other question here was, you mentioned before about the broadband internet service for remote areas. How long would that possibly take, do you think? And especially if the children have to continue online schooling, if this returns in the fall?
Yeah, well, to answer the first part is there is a sense of urgency here with this. I mean, I've been talking about it for a few years now, but the COVID pandemic has pointed out just how vital broadband is to delivery of basic things like education and healthcare. I will say this though, as not a caution, but in terms of good financial planning. there's been talk about spending some of that $2 billion to expand broadband throughout South Carolina. And that certainly is recognized as a legitimate COVID-related expense. However, if you'll note, Representative Clyburn and others in Congress are pushing a broadband bill right now in Congress that will provide billions of dollars to the states specifically for broadband. And I think that as we go about debating how we want to spend this $2 billion in COVID-related money, I think it's prudent for us to keep an eye on this alternative source of funding that's moving quickly up in DC, and don't go ahead and spend COVID money on something that may be applicable to another fund that is moving quickly up there. So, but I'll close out those observations with this. There is a widespread recognition in the General Assembly across party lines that providing broadband access to all parts of South Carolina is critical in that it's become a public good. I mean, care and education is becoming increasingly dependent upon broadband.
Okay, I think that is the end of the questions for right now. We'll keep going. Heather, you want to go on to the next question?
Sure.
Switch gears
Sure.
a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to switch gears just a little bit and ask a couple of questions about, we have heard that the legislature is going to return on May 12th. What are some legislation that's going to be taken up during that time? And I think you just kind of talked about this in the last response, but are you planning to go back in mid-September?
Yes, we've already been told by the Senate President and the Speaker of the House that we're not going to be operating under continuing resolution for the entire fiscal year, that we're going to do so simply because we don't have financial projections that we can rely upon to appropriate dollars in the usual way. So when we go back on May 12th, I mean, there's two things that we're going to take up and pass and get passed, I'm confident. One is that continuing resolution, because we need to make sure that come July 1, when the new fiscal year starts, even though we don't have a regular Appropriations Act passed, that state government continues to run, continues to operate, and that vital services are continuing to be provided. So we're going to pass a continuing resolution. The second thing that will pass, I think, is a sine die resolution. The language that's in the sine die resolutions that I've seen suggests that when we come back in September, we can also take up legislation that has passed one of the two houses of the legislature. So if there is a bill that originated in the Senate, passed the Senate, and is now over in the House, or if there is a bill that originated in the House, passed the House, and came over to the Senate, that universe of bills could be considered by the General Assembly when it comes back in September. Now, authorizing it to be taken up and having the bills actually taken up and passed are two different things. But I think that's what you're likely to see in this sine die resolution.
Okay, speaking of the resolution, is there any chance that Realtor priorities mentioning flood maps, business license fees, rollback tax legislation, will those opportunities be taken up?
Yeah, I think the rollback tax legislation, I think we were close to getting that done before the pandemic hit, and we couldn't go up to Columbia. So that had passed the House. It had gone through the committee process in the Senate. It was actually on the Senate calendar, and we were in negotiations with the counties and the municipalities, you know, but those negotiations were going well, and I didn't perceive there being anything that would, you know, block that. In regard to the other two things you mentioned, I think you said business license fees and flood mapping.
Yes.
I don't think, and I should know this, but I don't think that the business license bill ever passed the House. I know that it was on the floor for a long time because local governments had a problem with changing the calculus for how the business license fees could be collected. They wanted it against gross as opposed to net. There was some discussion in that regard. I don't recall whether or not that passed the House or not. My recollection is that it hadn't, but maybe I'm wrong. If it has passed the House, then it would certainly be one of the things that could be taken up. And I don't know whether or not the flood mapping has crossed one of the bodies either. So don't mean to be evasive. I just don't know the status of those two bills.
We understand you've been busy the last,
Yeah.
would you say 9 days, 15 hours a day?
Yeah,
Also, so Jean, we're going to go back to you to the chat room. Are there any other questions for
I
Senator Davis?
do. Yes, I do. One thing. Well, here's a question. Senator, do you know when hair salons are going to be open? The question. Valid question, sir.
Yeah, I don't know, but I can tell you from having talked to Governor McMaster that he approached this closure issue different than a lot of other governors did. What a lot of governors did, most governors did, is issue a blanket lockdown, closing all businesses, and then identified certain businesses that were essential businesses that could remain open. Governor McMaster did the opposite. He said the presumption is going to be everything is open unless we go ahead through executive order and shut it down. So it's a difference in approach. And as he eases that, as he goes ahead and rolls back, like he did for restaurants last week, as he goes back and rolls back the restrictions against those businesses that were closed, I think probably further down the continuum is going to be those professions and occupations that involve the immediate proximity of people. And so I don't even want to hazard a guess. I think it'll be sometime this month. I certainly think that. I think a lot of it depends upon what we see in terms of confirmed cases, what we see in terms of hospital utilization, what we see in terms of expanded testing, what we see in regard to all these data points. I think that's going to dictate when he says, okay, in looking at the totality of things, I think it is now safe for these activities to resume. And then to go back and reiterate a point I made earlier, Gene, when that does happen, I think there are going to be very specific protocols and best practices put into place. And look, everybody wants that, right? I mean, the businesses want that. The consumers want that. And so that will be developed and announced at the same time the restriction is rolled back. But beyond that, I really couldn't say more specifically.
I have one other question here. It's kind of a two-part question. Are there early projections of businesses that will be unable to open, including those that were beneficiary of the CARES Act? And do you anticipate the state establishing a support program for those businesses? And is there a generalized approach to how any allocation might be made?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the question Andy asked earlier about what are we going to do with that $1 billion in surplus one-time money. And it's very clear that even though a lot of South Carolina businesses successfully applied for the payroll protection program and EIDL, a lot couldn't, a lot didn't, either because the banks weren't responsive, they couldn't get SBA approval, the funds were exhausted. So yes, I think the answer to that question is, I think, as opposed, and that goes back to what I said earlier in response to Andy's question, as opposed to what that $1 billion in one-time money would typically be spent on in a regular fiscal year, you're going to see a strong bias toward those expenditures toward COVID-related things. And that includes, I think, helping those businesses that fell through the cracks. And as much as we possibly can, we want to create a level playing field so that people can come back. I mean, look, everybody's struggling, but you don't want some to struggle more than others unnecessarily.
Right, right. That's a question about our schools then. Without the sales taxes that we've had, without people here, what could possibly be the impact on our schools with the penny sales tax?
Yeah, well, in regard to our schools, there was a separate fund and a separate amount of money that has been provided in emergency education funding. And Molly Spearman is in the process of taking that money, looking at that money, deciding how it might be spent, and then she's going to let us know, okay, what are the needs of her constituencies, her school districts, her public schools, what those needs are. And again, unrelated to COVID, when we come back in September, I think our priority in regard to budgeting is going to remain what it was before this happened, which was trying to get our K through 12 system improved, trying to increase teacher salaries, trying to, teacher retiring and teachers, dropping out, so that focus remains. We'll just have to, try to meet that need given, the more restricted resources that we have. But K through 12 and public education and improving teacher salaries and improving things in the classroom, that will remain a budget priority when we come back in September to pass an appropriations bill for the next fiscal year.
Okay, I think that's it from the chat, Heather.
Okay. Well, we're going to switch gears just one more time, and
Sure.
You have another job as real estate attorney, and I would like to give a shout out to Lori and Sarah in your office because they do such a good job.
They do.
So we just kind of wanted to ask you what you're seeing in the market as far as your real estate attorney job.
Yeah, it's obviously it's slowed a little bit. You can look at it in two different ways. Stuff that's in the pipeline, but you haven't been able to close it simply because the pandemic has prevented the usual due diligence and the things that have to occur before a closing. But then you also have the pipeline. Is the pipeline filling back up? And I think right now the pipeline is not full. But I really think that's going to change. I think that as we emerge from this pandemic and as people feel that it's safe again, I mean, the things that drew people to South Carolina in general and Beaufort County in particular, those things remain. I mean, we've got sunshine, we've got water, we've got great people, we've got historic sites, we got all those things that make us an attractive destination. Those things haven't gone away. And I would argue in some respects, the desirability of South Carolina and Beaufort County in particular relative to some other areas of the country may be enhanced. And so I do think there's going to be a short-term period of here where we have to hold on. But I think long-term, the outlook looks very bright.
Thank you. Well, those are all the questions that we have for Senator Davis today. We want to thank you so much for all your support in Beaufort and Jasper County. Our membership always loves hearing from you, and we appreciate all the work that you have been doing. We also want to thank Ms. Jean and Jocelyn, our Government Affairs Director, for organizing this event today. We hope to see all of you guys soon. Remember, kindness matters, and you matter to our association. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.